This last testing technique targets the protocol layer of security extensions. At this point, we know their basic mechanisms used to intercept transactions, but there's more communications happening that we haven't investigated yet. Let's take a look at WallGuard for this demonstration. Without having much Web3 knowledge or understanding of dApp communications, WallGuard is a bit more informative in their logging practices, which makes it easier to demonstrate how a beginner in Web3 pentesting may have been able to find this next vulnerability and bypass. We're here on Uniswap. We'll refresh our page. We already have WallGuard installed. We see that is running. So let's go ahead and make a swap from ETH to repETH. And we see already that WallGuard put out some log messages. So we'll put this to the side. And if we're just kind of in an information gathering phase of a pen test, if we don't really know too much about the target we're testing, we look at different logs and anything that's available to us to understand more about the system we're testing. So if we look at these log statements, you'll see that the method send transaction was called, which we're already quite familiar with. The params value is also the same transaction data we're used to seeing, so nothing new here. We see request being sent and basically the same thing. And then we see this last log statement. And if we look into the request, we see these additional values, chain ID, we have an ID and an origin. So this is a couple new variables that we haven't seen before in our testing so far. So as a pen tester, I'd be thinking, how did WallGuard retrieve this information? Is it accessible to the user? So can the dApp control this data as it's being sent? So if I was a malicious scammer and I set up a website, could I do something to this data that would trip up the extension or cause it to malfunction in some way? Or ultimately, we are looking for a way to bypass it altogether. So is there a way for me to manipulate the chain ID, the ID, or the origin that would allow me to bypass the extension? To understand where this data is coming from, it would be helpful if we could look deeper at the communications. So we've already been using a logging script such as this, but if you look at the conditions here, we're only looking for these two transaction types. We could just remove this altogether and see if there's even more communications happening with the Ethereum provider. So let's try that again. We'll reject that. Already we see some communications happening. So results. Okay, we see a chain ID, but it's a result. So this must be some type of request, most likely. We have a result again. So we see ETH chain ID. That could have been the request to the result down here, chain 1, which is, if you understand how the chains work, we have the Ethereum mainnet on chain 1. We also have some other chain options, Binance Smart Chain of 56, and so on. We are on Ethereum mainnet, as you'll see here. So that's why you see the 1. And what's this other one? There's a request for the current block number. So that must be this result here. So as you can see, there's a lot more going on than just, passing around the transaction data. So as a pen tester, I'd be thinking, is there a way I can change this chain ID to some other value and see how that, and see what that might do to WallGuard as it tries to interpret the transaction. In my first video, I explained how the Ethereum provider is injected by MetaMask into the dApp, which if it's injected into the DOM of the dApp, that's user controllable. We can control the JavaScript libraries and the APIs that are made available. So it might be possible, and I'll show that it is possible for us to override the response when the ETH ID chain request is made. If you look at the documentation, this is the method that we saw being called, and it simply returns the chain ID as we saw. And again, all of these API calls are fair game when you're going about your pen testing. You can see how different methods can affect how a transaction is interpreted. I'll say most of these are probably not relevant at all to the extensions, but it's all worthy of review for sure. And then we also have the chain changed event, which every time you go into MetaMask to change your active or current chain, so changing it from Ethereum to Polygon, that would have initiated a chain changed event. And so it's also possible that we can forge that request or forge that communication to see if it's interpreted or trusted by the extension. At this point, I can demonstrate how it's possible to hook that API call and redefine it to do something else. In our case, we can redefine the ETH chain ID request so that every time it's called, we respond with a different chain ID. We'll refresh this so we can remove these, so we can remove the logging script. And this is an example of how you could get a reference to the Ethereum request method and redefine it here. What this does is every time the Ethereum.request method is called, we look to see if the method is equal to ETH chain ID. And if so, we simply return a 0, which 0 is an invalid chain ID. So we could have tried to use a different chain ID that like 56 until the extension that this is a transaction on the Binance Smart Chain, and that might work as well. But I'm going to use 0 as an invalid chain ID to see how it responds using that. And already you can see that the dApp has requested the chain ID, and we've already multiple times now responded with an invalid chain ID. So it seems to be doing something, but let's see if we can use this in an actual bypass. I have this proof of concept page I built with the bypass implemented, and we can toggle it on or off with this here. And each time it's toggled on, we override that request for the ETH ID or the chain ID, and we'll respond with a 0 as the chain ID. You can see it in the source right here. This is what we just demonstrated on Uniswap. So let's give it a try. Without it enabled, we see if we submit our request, it will be processed and intercepted by WalletGuard. But if we then toggle our bypass on and then submit it again, it skips WalletGuard and goes directly to MetaMask. You can see here that the chain ID was returned as chain ID 0.